there are some really important things happening all around the country. And one of them is a severe attack on the Voting Rights Act. That's how I'll frame it. Um, what's going on is now that the Supreme Court is hearing a case regarding the Voting Rights Act. It's from Louisiana, and it's about a district that is designed and drawn to ensure that there is some representation of Black people in the House of Representatives from the state of Louisiana, which has a very large proportion of Black people. But we know the history here, where if we don't have these safeguards, if we don't have this protection, then it is very likely that the representation of any group of people of color, which statistically tend to vote democratically, although that's not destiny anymore, that could be wiped out. That could be wiped out completely. And so this is a key, this is a massive thing. I mean, the entire sort of thrust of the civil rights movement was desegregation, but the two-pronged goal was voting rights. And it culminated in the 1965 Voting Rights Act through much trial and tribulation. And now, after decades and decades, where this was largely celebrated as an advance of democracy and moving toward a more perfect union, that is now being challenged in a very serious way. And from the opening statements and the questions that the justices were asking, it looks like it's in a real precarious situation. So, Robbie, have you tuned into that at all, or what do you think are some of the implications here?
Well, it's about Louisiana, right? But it certainly made me think about my home state of Mississippi and just what I know about Mississippi. Just a couple of, things that have always stuck out to me about how egregious the efforts, judicial, extrajudicial, terrorist efforts with the KKK to prevent African Americans from voting in the South was and how complete it was. For example, when my last book, I was writing about the Emmett Till case, and everybody knows it was an all-white jury, right, that refused to convict his murderers. But what people don't realize is that there was no way there could be anything other than a white jury
Mm.
at the time, because there was not a single African American registered to vote in the entire county at the time, right? So that's how like complete, utterly complete, it was. So there wasn't even anybody in the jury pool who was not white to be selected. And then just in my own hometown, like that's like so that's back in the 50s, but realizing that. So I grew up in Jackson. Jackson was about 40% black, about 60% white when I was growing up in the 80s, and it wasn't until 1985 that there was a single black representative on the Jackson City Council, because they
Mm.
had employed all kinds of crazy gerrymandering things, and then they had resorted to at-large election schemes to keep the kind of majority black districts from having a black representative, that kind of thing. And they did the same thing at the state level, right? So we had this after Reconstruction, we had this election of black senators and black representatives from Mississippi that were quickly kind of clawed back with, what, let's remind ourselves what white Christians in the state called redemption, right? Using kind of our Christian, kind of distortions of our Christian theology about that. But we did not have another black representative from Reconstruction until I graduated high school in 1986, right? So I mean, that's the kind of history that we're talking about here. That's not that long ago, right? That we began to get any correctives, and we would not have gotten any of those correctives without the Voting Rights Act, and without those states being put under surveillance, because they had this history of violence. They had this history of unfair voting practices and intentional practices to keep black people from registering to vote, or if they were registered to vote, to keep them from actually voting. So this is not like made up history that's way back when. I mean, this is like our lifetimes.
Diana, this is going to be maybe a little bit sideways, but I'm not proposing that there's one single form of government that's quote unquote truly Christian, but I'm wondering from a faith perspective, or an ethical perspective, why we ought to be concerned about this rollback of the Voting Rights Act beyond, the representation, the actual representation in Congress? Why, from a faith standpoint, ought this to matter to us?
Well, it obviously matters on several fronts about the dignity and the worth of every human being. I mean, so theologically, it's very wrapped up in looking at humanity as everyone being fully human. And so if you don't go there, you're already missing a whole big part of the biblical story. And so theologically it makes a difference. I was really thinking about it a little bit, sort of sideways. You were asking me a sideways question. I was thinking about your sideways question sideways. Um, and that is how much the people around me when I was a little girl in the 1960s hated and feared the civil rights acts, hated the
Mm,
voting rights acts. And I can remember conversations, so I would have been very small, but I can remember sitting at tables with grown-ups saying, well, what's next? A black mayor in the city of Baltimore. And it was this fear of black overlords that was so terrifying to a lot of the white working class and white middle class people I grew up around, that it was part of the incentive to moving out into the counties.
mm,
And even when I was in graduate school at Duke, there was still a huge rift and fight between Durham City and Durham County, and it was absolutely 100% around race, around whether or not black politicians would have anything to say over the lives of white people. And it was also related to how the schools would be funded and what the schools would teach. And so I just remember this absolute fear of black power that manifested itself in the lives of, you know, all the white people I knew who
mm,
were,
mm,
and I was related to growing up. And that realization, I mean, it sort of stuck with me, my whole life is like, one, why are people so afraid? It seemed kind of crazy to me. But then I remember running it into it again in evangelical churches and
mm,
how much the white evangelicals in my teenage years and college years hated the 1960s. And actually, a huge part of what they wanted to do was go back to the 1950s. And one of the reasons they wanted to go back to the 1950s was that the sphere of women and the sphere of potential power, particularly for Black men, was limited, or non-existent. And so for me, there is the theological piece about dignity and the worth of every human being, and how that is just a necessary component of what it means to be a Christian, is to hold those views. But then there's also this longer sort of political quest of taking away those rights which had been broadened in that particular decade. And anytime there's an attack on the civil rights of African Americans in this country, it is also a threat to all women in this country. So, of course, Black women are in a sort of double jeopardized stance there. But what happens with this in the Supreme Court? I'm looking at that as a white woman and saying, okay, well, this is the kind of step that becomes part of another desire in that community. And that would be to somehow limit or even take away women's rights to vote.
mm. You both bring up some powerful perspectives here. Diana, to your point, if we all have equal dignity and worth, Genesis chapter 1, then we all have a voice. and that voice deserves to be heard. And in a democratic system, your vote is your voice. So to
right.
take away the opportunity to vote and to elect your representatives, people who are from your community, who understand your situation, is to take away your political voice in a sense. And then, Robbie, everything you're saying about Mississippi is spot on. I keep trying to tell people in my stumbling, fumbling way that if you want to know what's coming down the road, all you got to do is look at Mississippi past and present. And, to me, what this Voting Rights Act is about is a couple of things. One, you'll hear a lot of times people say, we've only even had a semblance of a participatory democracy in this country for about 60 years. And they date it back to the Voting Rights Act, which finally opened up access for basically every group of people, more so than it was certainly during the Jim Crow era. The other thing that really is chilling to me about this is if they overturn this section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which, by the way, they've already overturned another section of the Voting Rights Act known as the pre-clearance section, that says places with a history of racial gerrymandering against Black people and other racial and ethnic minorities, they have to get pre-clearance before they make any major changes to make sure it's not discriminatory. That's already been overturned. So now they're going for another part of it to gut it. What really is chilling to me about that is if they overturn it, and if they get, again, these majority white districts where there's very little Black representation in particular, then whatever happens in Congress is technically legal. So they've hit it at the state level, who the states are sending to Congress. And then whatever laws they choose to pass or not pass, whatever policies they choose to enact or not, it's all legal. This is how the process is supposed to work. And then it's much, much harder then to claim, oh, well, you're breaking the law. Well, no, these are duly elected representatives. They're
Right.
voting in Congress. This is the way bills get passed into law. What are you complaining about? Well, what we're complaining about is the centuries of discrimination in this nation. And to me, fundamentally, the error is thinking that, well, since we've seen progress, we no longer need the safeguards or the rules that led us to progress. We won. We did it. We're finished. We're done. So take away these rules. No, 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 no. And these are supposed to be Christians who have read Genesis 3 and the fall, right? They are just trusting people to do the right thing all the time, which, especially in politics, we know it's not going to happen. So it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, the other value I would just appeal to here is just simple fairness.
Mm,
That Christians, say they care about, right? And just like, yeah, treating each other with dignity and respect, like that thing. But it's also this principle of fairness. Like, why would we put ourselves, if you're truly Christian, why would you put yourself on the side of not arguing for fairness, right? That one person, one vote should be like not just an aphorism, but like something that is real and something has real power. And just back to Mississippi again. So the state, even today, Mississippi is about 40% African American. We have one Black representative, one, because of gerrymandering in the state of Mississippi, right? And like there's no way that's justifiable when you kind of think about how that works, and you only get there through all kinds of nefarious, underhanded schemes, right? And why we can't just say like, look, as Christians, we're not for. Like gerrymandering is cheating, right? We're not for cheating, right? We're not for lying about whether this is really a representative government. That's not who we are. Like we should have more integrity than that. And I think kind of putting it that way, that gerrymandering is a lack of integrity, right? It's cheating, and that we really ought to be like against that, right? And not just kind of say, oh well, yeah, but it helps our side. And so there's our moral argument is it's okay because it helps us.
Yeah, I think
on
one of the, sort of things that you would hear in reply to that is that, well, you cheated first.
mhm.
You invented affirmative action. You set up these people who didn't deserve these things and put them in places of power. And so we have to cheat back in order to take away your capacity to cheat. And so really, I mean, I agree with you. And yet I'm hearing that other thing echoing in my mind is that there is this other narrative, where what we three might perceive as fair, certainly what Kristen would too. Now I will speak for her. What we would perceive as fair, they think we were cheating from the outset.
It is incredibly frustrating to me that that simple fairness, doesn't prevail. Although, if you look at the news feed and the headlines of far right, like it is in a complete different universe.